The cab of my Peterbilt is my second home. Some guys might say it's their first, especially after a divorce or two, but for me, it's a solid second. It's got everything I need. A bed that's seen better days but still holds the shape of my body. A mini fridge that hums a constant, low tune. And a coffee maker that's brewed enough jet fuel to power a small moon landing. The smell is a permanent cocktail of old coffee, diesel fumes, and the pine tree air freshener that's been hanging from my mirror since the Bush administration, the second one. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. You learn to read the road like other men read newspapers. You see the stories in the tread of a blown-out tire, the frantic pace of a minivan full of kids, the weary slump of a fellow driver at a rest stop. This particular run was a standard one. I was hauling a load of unspecified machinery. You learn not to ask too many questions from Spokane, Washington, to Billings, Montana. It's a route I've done 100 times, a familiar rhythm of mountain passes, long, straight stretches through the high desert, and the gradual climb into the Big Sky country. My plan was simple: get through the Coeur d'Alene National Forest before sunset, push across the Idaho Panhandle, and then tackle the long, lonely stretch of I-90 that cuts through the western half of Montana in the deep, dark heart of the night. That's when I do my best driving, when the world is asleep, and it's just me, the hum of my tires, and the long, lonely song of the asphalt. I stopped for dinner at a greasy spoon just outside of Missoula. The place was called the Wagon Wheel, and it had the kind of neon sign that flickered like a dying man's last heartbeat. The coffee was thick enough to stand a spoon in, and the chicken fried steak had a texture not unlike the tread on my tires, but it was hot and it filled the hole. I saw an old-timer, a rancher by the look of his worn-out boots and the deep, leathery tan on his neck, sitting at the counter, nursing a cup of the same tar black coffee. We got to talking, the way strangers do in the middle of nowhere. Just idle chatter about the weather, the price of beef, the usual dot as I was getting ready to leave, settling my bill with a crumpled $10 bill. I mentioned I was heading east on the 90 towards Bozeman and then Billings. The old man's eyes, which had been half closed and peaceful, suddenly sharpened. He looked at me, a real, penetrating look. "You driving through the night, son?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly thing. I told him I was. He nodded slowly, as if turning over a heavy thought in his mind. "You watch the road out there, past the divide. There's a stretch. It plays tricks on a tired man's eyes." I laughed it off, told him I'd seen every trick the road had to offer. He didn't smile. He just leaned in a little closer, and the smell of stale tobacco and earth washed over me. "Just remember," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "the line is just paint. Don't you go chasing it." It was a strange thing to say, but you hear all sorts of things from lonely old men in diners at midnight. I dismissed it as the ramblings of someone who'd spent too many years under the big, empty sky. I thanked him for the advice, tipped my hat, and walked out into the cool Montana night. The air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the smoky diner. I climbed back into my rig, fired up the big diesel engine, and pulled out onto the on-ramp. The white lines of the breakdown lane began their familiar, hypnotic flicker as I passed over them. Thump thump, thump thump, a steady, reassuring heartbeat. I settled in, found a classic rock station that was already starting to crackle with static, and pointed my 18 wheels into the darkness. The old man's words were already fading, just another ghost in my rearview mirror. For the first hour or so, everything was normal. The road was a black ribbon unfurling under my headlights, the dash center line ticking by like a metronome keeping perfect time. The mountains were just hulking, darker shapes against a sky thick with stars. Montana at night is a different kind of dark. It's not the absence of light. It's a presence, a heavy, velvety blackness that seems to swallow sound and light whole. My high beams cut to lonely tunnels through it, illuminating a world that existed for just me and my truck for a few seconds before being consigned back to the void. I passed a few other night crawlers, a car with suitcases strapped to the roof, another big rig with its company logo glowing proudly on the side. We'd flash our brights at each other, a silent salute of solidarity in the endless night. But soon, even that traffic thinned out. The radio station finally gave up the ghost, dissolving into a hiss of white noise. I switched it off, preferring the silence to the frantic search for another signal. The only sounds were the deep-throated rumble of my engine, the constant whine of the tires on the pavement, and the rhythmic thump-thump-thump as I crossed the reflective dots between the lanes. It was in this deep silence that I first noticed it. A flicker of movement at the very edge of my perception. I glanced down at the center line. It was just a line. White, dashed, perfectly normal. I shook my head, blaming it on the chicken fried steak or one too many cups of bad coffee. I'd been on the road for 12 hours straight. My eyes were bound to get a little weird. I cracked my window, letting a blast of cold, mountain air slap me in the face. It was bracing, clearing the fog from my brain. For another 20 miles, everything was fine. Then it happened again. This time, I was sure of it. The line, one specific dash of paint, seemed to twitch. It was a quick, serpentine motion, like the tail of a lizard disappearing under a rock. My hands tightened on the wheel. "Okay, you're tired," I said out loud, my voice strange in the quiet cab. Really tired. I decided it was time for my emergency measure. I reached into my cooler and pulled out a can of the most vile, high-caffeine energy drink on the market. It tasted like carbonated battery acid and sweeteners, but it did the job. I chugged half the can, grimacing at the chemical aftertaste. I focused my eyes on the road ahead, deliberately ignoring the center line. I counted the mile markers. I recited the lyrics to every AC/DC song I knew. I did everything to keep my mind occupied and my eyes from drifting to that hypnotic, pulsing line. And for a while, it worked. The caffeine began to course through my system, sharpening the edges of the world. The dark seemed a little less oppressive. I started to feel foolish for letting an old man's superstition get to me. This was just paint. Simple, inert, industrial-grade paint. But just as that thought solidified in my mind, the line directly in front of my truck didn't just twitch. It moved. It wasn't a trick of the light or a blur from my tired eyes. The solid, straight, white dash seemed to liquefy for a split second. It curved, sinuously, like a ribbon being pulled sideways, before snapping back into place as my front wheels passed over the spot where it had been. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. This wasn't fatigue. This was something else. I slowed down, my heart now hammering against my ribs. The old man's words echoed in my head, no longer a rambling, but a warning. Don't you go chasing it. I was wide awake now, and I was terrified. I considered pulling over, just finding the next white spot on the shoulder, shutting down the engine, and trying to get a few hours of sleep until the sun came up. But a deeper, more primal instinct told me to keep moving. Stopping felt like surrendering, like admitting that this thing, whatever it was, had won. It felt like letting the darkness and the silence of this empty stretch of Montana consume me. So I kept driving, but I reduced my speed, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my eyes glued to the road ahead. For the next few miles, the phenomenon became more pronounced. It was no longer a single, questionable event. The center line was alive. It wasn't a constant, flowing river, but a series of independent, malicious little movements. A dash would suddenly slither off towards the shoulder, as if trying to escape the road itself. Another would seem to bunch up, coiling like a snake ready to strike, before my headlights washed over it and it became inert paint once more. The most unsettling were the ones that seemed to rush towards my tires, a suicidal lunge into the path of 18 tons of rolling steel. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. A heat haze. It was a cold night. A problem with my eyes. I blinked rapidly. The world remained sharp. A neurological event. A stroke. I didn't have any other symptoms. I felt the steering wheel's familiar vibration. I could still feel my feet in my boots. This was external. This was real. The old man's story came back to me in a horrifyingly clear flash. The spirit of a road inspector who died painting this line. Was I really entertaining that? A ghost? A sentient strip of highway paint? It sounded insane, but what other explanation was there? The fear was a physical thing now, a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the night air. It was a ball of ice in my gut. Every time a section of the line moved, a jolt of pure, undiluted adrenaline would shoot through my system. I was no longer a seasoned trucker in control of his domain. I was a lab rat in a maze, and the walls of my maze had just started to writhe. I found myself talking to the road, to the line, my voice a tight, nervous whisper. Just stay put, damn you. Just be paint. I saw a sign for a rest area in 1 mile. Relief, sweet and powerful, flooded through me. Civilization, light, other people, maybe. A place to stop where I wouldn't be alone with this madness. I put on my turn signal, the rhythmic clicking a comforting, man-made sound. I started to ease over into the right lane, my eyes fixed on the green and white sign ahead. And that's when I made my mistake. In my desperate focus on the rest area, I wasn't watching the center line as closely as I had been. A long, languid dash, which had been lying still, suddenly whipped across my lane, directly under my front wheels. It was an instinctive reaction, the kind drilled into you over a million miles. You see something dart in front of you, you swerve to avoid it. My brain, for a split second, registered it as a small animal, a rabbit, a squirrel. I jerked the wheel hard to the right. The entire rig shuddered, a violent lurch that sent my coffee mug flying from its holder and crashing against the passenger door. The trailer swayed dangerously behind me, a protesting groan of metal and shifting weight. I fought the wheel, my arms straining, correcting the fishtail before it could turn into a full-blown jackknife. I straightened out, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I had just nearly wrecked my truck trying to avoid a hallucination. Or something worse, I didn't pull into the rest area. I sped right past it, my eyes wide with a new kind of terror. It wasn't just showing off anymore. It was trying to get me to crash. The old man's warning was now a commandment carved in stone. Don't you go chasing it. And I had. I had swerved. I had taken the bait. And now, I had a terrible feeling the game had changed. The road after the rest area felt different. The movements of the line were no longer random, playful, or even just menacing. They felt purposeful, strategic. It was as if my reaction had confirmed something for it, that I could see it, that I was a player in its twisted game. The dash began to move in more complex patterns. Sometimes, they would all shift in unison, creating a gentle, flowing curve in a road I knew was straight. My truck would start to drift with the illusory bend, and I'd have to wrench it back, fighting against my own senses. Other times, they would create gaps. A long section with no dash at all, just empty, black asphalt, making me question if I was even in my lane anymore. Then, just as panic began to set in, a cluster of them would swarm back into view, writhing and tangled like a nest of worms. I was gripping the wheel so hard my fingers were going numb. My shoulders were knots of tension. The caffeine from the energy drink was now working against me, heightening my fear, making me jittery and hyper-aware of every tiny, impossible movement. I tried to find a pattern, a logic to its behavior. Was it trying to run me off the road, lure me into the oncoming lane? Or was it just playing? The thought was somehow more horrifying than a direct attack. This was a cat-and-mouse game on a two-lane highway in the dead of night, and I was the mouse. I glanced in my side mirrors. The lines I had already passed over were perfectly normal, static, and white in the glow of my taillights. The insanity was only in front of me, only in the path I was about to take. It was hurting me. A new fear began to dawn on me, cold and suffocating. What if this never ended? What if this stretch of road, this haunted, painted hell, went on for 100 miles? How long could I maintain this level of white-knuckle concentration before I made a fatal mistake? My fuel was good for another 300 miles. My body and mind, however, were already running on fumes. The initial surge of terror was giving way to a deep, grinding exhaustion. I was a puppet, and the strings were being pulled by a madman with a bucket of paint. I saw the glow of headlights in the distance. Another vehicle. Hope, frail and desperate, blossomed in my chest. Another witness, another soul to share this burden. Maybe if someone else was here, the phenomenon would stop. Maybe it only preyed on the lonely. I watched the headlights grow closer, a pair of piercing eyes in the dark. As the car approached, I held my breath, watching the center line between us. It was perfectly still. The car, a small sedan, blew past me in the opposite lane without a hint of hesitation. The driver was probably listening to the radio, thinking about his destination, completely oblivious to the nightmare happening just a few feet away. As soon as the car's red taillights disappeared around a bend behind me, the line in front of me gave a violent, convulsive shudder. A series of dashes twisted themselves into a shape that looked, for one heart-stopping second, like a crude, screaming human face before dissolving back into formless paint. It was a message. A taunt. You are alone. This is for you. The hope I had felt curdled into a bitter, absolute despair. There was no help coming. This was my trial to run, and I had no idea what the rules were, or if there was a finish line. The exhaustion was winning. My eyelids felt like sandpaper, each blink a struggle. The constant, low-grade terror had drained me. I was no longer reacting with sharp jolts of adrenaline. It was a dull, throbbing dread that had settled into my bones. The line's movements became more brazen, more fluid. It was no longer just individual dashes. They were connecting, flowing into one another, creating a continuous, slithering white serpent that ran down the center of my lane. I was no longer driving on a road. I was following a path laid out by a malevolent force. I found myself slipping into a strange, detached state. The roar of the engine seemed distant. The vibration of the wheel was a faint buzz in my hands. My world had shrunk to the 50 feet of asphalt illuminated by my headlights and the undulating, living line that dominated it. I started to think about the old man's story in more detail. A road inspector, a man who died doing his job. What would that feel like, to have your life's work be these monotonous, dashed lines on a forgotten stretch of highway? To be so consumed by the routine, the rhythm of the paint sprayer, that even death couldn't break the cycle? Was he lonely? Was this his way of finding company, by tormenting the night drivers who passed through his domain? Or was he angry, trapped forever in the medium of his work, a slave to the road he helped create? I felt a bizarre pang of sympathy amidst the fear. What a hellish eternity that would be. To never rest, to just paint, and watch, and wait, night after night, for a driver tired enough, lonely enough, to see you. My truck began to drift again. I wasn't swerving this time. It was a gentle, insidious pull. The line was creating a subtle, persistent curve, guiding me towards the shoulder. I corrected, but it was a sluggish, late reaction. The tires on the passenger side rumbled loudly over the warning strips cut into the pavement. The sound jolted me back to full alertness. I was inches from the gravel shoulder and a steep, unseen drop-off into the darkness. That was its goal. It wasn't trying to make me crash head-on. It was trying to gently, patiently, lure me off the road. I had to fight back. I couldn't just be a passenger in my own rig. I made a decision, one that went against every fiber of my being. I focused my eyes not on the road ahead, but on the solid, steady white line of the shoulder to my right, the one that marked the edge of the world. I used it as my anchor, my true north. I let the writhing, chaotic center line exist in my peripheral vision, a distracting, maddening flicker, but I refused to give it my full attention. It was like ignoring a spider crawling on your face. Every instinct screamed to look, to react. The line did not like this. Its movements became more frantic, more aggressive. It would throw itself directly in front of my tires, trying to startle me into looking. It would form sharp, impossible angles. It was throwing a tantrum. I held fast, my jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth would crack. My eyes were burning with the strain of focusing on the boring, static shoulder line. I was winning. I had found a loophole. I was not going to chase it. I was going to outlast it. I don't know how long I drove like that. It could have been 20 minutes. It could have been 2 hours. Time had lost all meaning in the gray, fear-soaked monotony. My body was a machine, my hands making tiny, automatic corrections on the wheel, my foot maintaining a steady pressure on the accelerator. My mind was a fortress, its walls built on the mundane, uncheckable reality of the shoulder line. The chaos in the center of the road was just noise now. Terrifying, impossible noise, but noise nonetheless. And then, something changed. The frantic, angry movements began to slow. The serpentine flow lost its vigor. The dash, which had been so fluid and connected, began to separate again. Their movements became less purposeful, more like the random, tired twitches I had seen at the very beginning. It was as if the thing, the spirit, the presence, whatever it was itself growing weary. My refusal to engage, my stubborn focus on the immutable, was draining its power. A faint, gray light began to tinge the eastern horizon. It wasn't sunrise, not yet, but the first hint that the long night was finally coming to an end. The impenetrable blackness around me began to soften into shades of deep blue and charcoal. I could see the silhouettes of hills and the shapes of trees. The world was slowly, painstakingly, returning to itself. As the light grew, minute by minute, the movements of the line grew fainter, less frequent by the time the sun was a thin, brilliant orange line on the edge of the world. The line was just a line, white, dashed, inert paint on black asphalt. The final twitch I saw was a small, almost apologetic shiver from a single dash right before my wheels passed over it. And then there was nothing, just the road, stretching out before me, perfectly normal in the dawn's early light. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel relief. I felt hollowed out, scooped clean, like a survivor of a shipwreck washed up on a foreign shore. I saw a sign up ahead, Bozeman 30 miles, civilization, a place to stop, to breathe. I didn't slow down. I kept driving, my eyes fixed on the road, now blessedly, mundanely real. The nightmare was over. The spell was broken by the sun. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that it was still there. It was always there, sleeping, waiting for the next long, lonely night, and the next tired, vulnerable driver to come down its stretch of road. I pulled into a truck stop on the outskirts of village just as the morning shift was starting their day. The lot was full of the sounds of air brakes and idling engines. The smell of grease and diesel was strong, a familiar, comforting stink. I parked my rig in a far corner, shut down the engine, and just sat there for a long time. The silence was deafening. My hands were still shaking. I looked at my face in the rearview mirror. I looked old. My eyes were sunken into dark, bruised sockets, and there was a new network of lines etched around them that I didn't remember from the day before. I climbed out of the cab, my legs stiff and unsteady. The sunlight felt alien on my skin, too bright, too cheerful. I walked towards the diner, my footsteps echoing in the crisp morning air. Inside, it was a riot of normalcy. Truckers were laughing over plates of eggs. Waitresses called out orders. The clatter of cutlery and the sizzle of the grill were a symphony of human life. I took a seat at the counter, my back to the wall so I could see the door. A different waitress, a young woman with a bright smile, came over with a pot of coffee. "Rough night, honey?" she asked, her voice full of a kindness that almost broke me. I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. She filled my mug without another word. I wrapped my hands around the hot ceramic, letting the warmth seep into my cold fingers. I stared into the dark liquid, seeing not coffee, but the memory of that slithering white line in the darkness. I never told anyone. Who would I tell? The Dot, my dispatcher. They'd think I was on meth or that I'd finally cracked from the solitude. I finished my delivery, collected my pay, and took a week off. I spent it at home, with the curtains open, watching the sunlight move across my living room floor. But the road always calls you back. The mortgage doesn't pay itself. I still drive that route. I have to. It's part of the job. But I never, ever drive it at night. I'll take a nap in a rest area. I'll lose hours of schedule. I'll pay fines for being late, I don't care. I plan my runs so that I hit that particular stretch of I-90 in broad daylight. And in the sunlight, it's just a road. A beautiful one, actually, with rolling hills and big skies. But sometimes, when I'm driving it during the day, I'll see a fresh patch of paint on the asphalt, a repair to the center line. And I'll wonder if he's still working, even now, adding a new dash, fixing a faded one. And I'll feel a cold trickle of fear, knowing that when the sun goes down, that new, wet paint will dry under the stars, and the game will begin again for someone else. I keep my eyes on the shoulder, I listen to loud music, and I pray for the sun to stay in the sky just a little bit longer, because I know what's out there when it gets dark, and I know I can never, ever look at a simple white line the same way again.